Overwatch 6v6 testing is around the corner, and there are a lot of questions to be asked about what kind of balance changes they're going to make for this test and how things are going to shape up. And I want to put my hat in the ring here and just kind of walk you through every tank in the game right now and kind of how I think they're going to be classified come the Overwatch 2 test, or mainly what I think we can do with them to change them into that 6v6 format that we kind of know and love. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean off tank and main tank, right? Overwatch 2's designs have definitely been more geared to making a lot of tanks that are mostly main tank, but still kind of do like an off tank job, right? So you can, you don't need to have that other tank on the battlefield. Now, of course, there are a couple DPS that kind of do that off tank job as well, in my opinion. But for the most part, I think a lot of tanks have been kind of flattened out to be much more capable of taking space on their own, with a couple of few exceptions. But what I want to do in this video is create a list and kind of go through each character. Would they work as a main tank? Would they work as an off tank? How would you change their abilities or their kits to make them work in a 6v6 format that we know of, right? This is not really an endorsement of 6v6. It's not really going through the problems that I would want to fix with 6v6. This is solely a creative exercise just by our understanding and definition of what 6v6 looks like. How do we go from there with the characters that we have? So I want to start out here with Reinhardt and get like the basic characters out of the way. What is a main tank, right? A main tank, in my opinion, is a character that engages and tries to take space for your team, right? Whether they go in and kind of create diversions or ways for your team to move in after that, or they directly protect them, like this, right? Walk in, shield, that's protecting your team through chokes. That is the job of a main tank. And as they get forward, that is more space that they have created for their team to play in, right? Now my team can play here instead of playing all the way back there. I'm gonna turn the master volume down just a little bit. But that's kind of the main tank idea, right? The off tank idea, of course, is more about bullying the space that the main tank has made, right? Helping the main tank sustain in the fight, right? So let's say Reinhardt's gotten here as D.Va. Now that I know his shield resource is low, now I DM him while he is swinging. I guess I hit micro missiles on accident when I put my hand down. And then I go contest angles that my main tank or even the rest of my team can't do as well, right? I am a force to be reckoned with. Wow. A force to be reckoned with, right? If somebody tries to come up here and contest me, they're going to get micro missile, they're going to get shotgunned away, right? All of that good stuff. So we'll talk about Rein again, right? So Rein is a main tank. I don't think there's a world where he ever would be an off tank, and I don't think anyone would want him to be an off tank. It doesn't quite work that way, right? Good tools to get himself in and get his teammates in, but he kind of relies on other people to keep him there and keep him doing a lot to make him a threat, right? Especially in 6v6 when you have less health and everything. Once Reinhardt starts swinging like this, that's when people want to shoot him and they want to kill him, right? That is a very big thing that you have to keep in mind with Reinhardt. Now, he does have a couple of new additions. You can cancel your charge. You have 2 fire strikes. I think that these would make him more versatile, and it would be okay. I don't think any of these changes really eliminate his weaknesses as a main tank that he kind of needs his other off tanks to help with. So honestly, I think they're fine. It'll make him more engaging. It'll give him more of a role to do more often, which I think is just a general Overwatch 2 philosophy that I kind of agree with, is allowing characters to do not more varied things always, but also just to have higher uptime, because uptime is fun. So I think that's totally fine. Reinhardt, pretty classic main tank. Now, the other main tank we'll talk about is Winston. He is kind of like the dive variation. Winston is a little different in the ways that he grants space, right? He's going to jump in, and when he gets there, he's going to throw his bubble down, and this is the diversion that he needs to get his team to walk in or set up behind him, right? Winston is not always as all in. He'll kind of go over here sometimes and get some poke, and then kind of chill and wait and get some resources back, make them scared, make them use resources. When he's ready to go, then he jumps in and he throws this bubble in and he hard commits. Off tank follows up. Rest of his team set up in the process, very similar to Reinhardt, just a little different in execution, and of course in the maps and styles that you play him with. Right, he has a lot of weaknesses, even in his engagement department, but you know, the off tanks, offset that really well. And for Overwatch 2 changes, the right click can stay. Just give him some nice poke. It just makes his gameplay loop a little more fun and gives him a little bit more decision making. I bogged my head when he goes in to make jumps and engages. So that's Winston, quickly trying to get through the characters that are pretty cut and dry. Zarya, of course, enables the main tank to be aggressive, right? So like a Reinhardt, he goes in, he's out of shield, where he's really low on shield and he wants to keep walking and swinging on the enemy. That's when the Zarya bubble comes in, lets him do that with a little less risk. And in that same time, that builds Zarya up. She is kind of like a mid to late fight tank. So she's going to be not so much as good at taking space, because when she takes the space, she's no longer a threat, right? You want to be able to take the space and be a threat. So using it on somebody else, being the secondary option, right? That will allow her to then be a menace later on if you allow them to be, right? That is where Zarya does a lot. Now, she's got a limited range, but if Zarya has full charge and you allow her to build up, well, of course, she's absolutely going to annihilate you. So that is kind of where Zarya's off-tank options come in as well. She likes to, I call it like ping-ponging with her allies, right? Ping-pong aggression with your main tank, your off-tank, and even some of your flex DPS, like your Maze, or, you know, probably even like a Venture or something nowadays, a Reaper like that, right? The only thing that I think we got to talk about with Zarya, of course, is the bubble resources. Does she need to go all the way back to just 1-1? That's not a bad option. I definitely don't think she should be able to double bubble allies. That is definitely too much. Double self-bubbling, probably not the worst idea ever. If you go for greedier self-bubbles, then, you know, they might be weaker or not last as long or come back much slower. But if you go for the ally bubble, which is only one, you kind of waste a lot of your charge on it. I don't know, that could be interesting, but the safe bet is to not let her do that. Now, D.Va is, you know, classic. I think she's kind of like the quintessential off tank. She negates a lot of damage. She puts a lot of damage out herself. She can test places that her main tank can't necessarily be or shouldn't necessarily be mid-fight. Make space for her DPS to do that, right? So she can go contest an angle up here, and then now it's like, okay, Genji, you can come to climb up here now. Well, I go to the next high ground and clear that, and we kind of go through in there. And Winston and I go at the same time, so I'm gonna meet him there, and I'm gonna DM him when we get there so that he can stay in there longer, stuff like that. Pretty classic. The only thing about D.Va, of course, I guess I should note that this is kind of assuming old health, relatively old tank power level, relatively, not with the Overwatch 2 changes. So the only like fundamental Overwatch 2 changes, I think, are the ones that change their playstyle more. So defense matrix being super duper long and coming back not as slow needs to go away, because it would make D.Va super frustrating to play into, like she kind of already is sometimes. Those are the characters that are pretty like cut and dry cases. I don't think anyone is going to argue with that, right? We are yapping about 6v6. No one's gonna argue about that, right? Rein, Winston, classic main tanks. Zarya, D.Va, classic off tanks. But let's go into the two characters that are I think are probably going to stay in their roles, but maybe need a little bit more digestion, something to look at with these characters as potential hybrid-esque characters, or ones that were pretty tough in Overwatch 1 to deal with or were just not as fun. So Wrecking Ball, of course, traditionally a main tank. Now, he creates space and ways to get into the fight much more chaotically, I think, right? It's not as traditional as Winston, where there's a barrier down and you have to respect him. Ball can kind of come from anywhere, and in fact, he has more trouble setting up. It's the setup phase, which is where he's going to find most of his trouble. But once he can get in with resources, then he gets his bubble. He's got his shields, which let him stay in the fight and do all of that, right? He's a bit of a disruptor, and once the chaos ensues, that is when people the rest of your team are allowed to go, right? But he requires a lot of help from the off tank, mostly a diva or a character who is extremely self-sufficient, who will be taking a lot of resources away while the ball sets up, right? He can be independent and he can be team-oriented. That's why he's kind of like a bit of a hybrid style. There used to be kind of like a double main tank dive that was never really good, but it was a more experiment thing that you could run, where Winston and Ball just kind of hit at the exact same time, Ball coming in from who even knows where, and creating this really powerful dive that didn't quite work because of characters like Brig and Baptiste and all of that, but it was a cool idea nonetheless. The new changes that they've given him also give him more options for like setup, engagement, and even like potentially peel, although that one I don't think is as strong. It's not as versatile as you would think. The only thing that prevents me from saying like, oh, Wrecking Ball could be an off tank is that he just does not hold space by himself very well. And I think that is kind of the big downfall for Wrecking Ball, right? Is that he is not really a super big threat like a Zarya would charge or a diva on a high ground, right? Ball is much more counterable. He's, I don't want to call him fragile because of his high health pool and his shields, but we have not talked about the Piggy Pal. But Ball does, it's just difficult. Like, what is the reason? Like, how does Ball not get forced out? He's kind of a character that is survivability comes from mobility and like escape rather than hard engagement. So he doesn't quite do that off tank job like I think he's supposed to. He doesn't do a really big damage presence. So I think Ball will stay as the main tank, even with some of his changes. Giving shields to allies, that's just as silly. I don't think it's really an off-tank duty, especially with how little you give to actual tanks in comparison to their higher health pools. It's really not much. Ooh, Sigma. Okay. So Sigma is one of the characters in Overwatch 2 that I think public perception of and frustration playing against went down because he was really enabled by higher sustain and his other tank doing really well, but when he doesn't have those as much, Sigma, his weaknesses show more, and you actually do get to have a nice, fun engage with him. So, solid thing where Ball could stay in whatever form he was CC'd in for, like, quality of life. Yeah, I think that's probably not a bad idea, but I'm pretty sure a lot of them are still kind of like that, depending on the CC. But for Sigma, he has self-sustain, range, and damage. It makes him an incredible off-tank. He's got really good survivability, really good bullying. Like let's say somebody took this space and I can just kind of get here and bully and no one's going to be able to come around. I can kite around this. I can take a really good duel. That is something really good for Sigma, and especially off-tanks, is that they can take really good duels with their tools and their damage, right? So staying as an off-tank, though, you would have to ensure that he was not as powerful as overbearing as he was. This doesn't actually necessarily have to come with super big nerfs to Sigma. It really needs to come to sustain, and also since Orisa doesn't exist anymore, you have to get a little more creative with your compositions. So as much as I had a concept where Sigma could play more like a main tank, where he got like a speed boost when he was casting shields so he could walk with it, or stuff like that, kind of reducing his general overall sustain. I think he just works most as an off tank. So with him in that role, I think we need to consider a couple of things to make him not so overbearing, right? So if you decrease the duration of his grasp, then he doesn't have as much survivability. We need to rely on his supports and maybe his other tank a little more. You lower his shield health so that it's actually much more of a kind of like an active tool that's not really one that he'll play around as much. It's gonna be more of like blocking lesser damage rather than like hard sustain. That might be a nice middle ground. And also I think the explosion damage here probably toned down a little bit. I don't think an off tank should have so much massive cleave. I think that is more of like a main tank thing, especially since off tank ults are super good. If you're just shooting into cores and getting more damage on average because the explosion damage is higher, then Sigma will be kind of a menace building ults and getting a lot of damage in. But I think Sigma, again, still off tank. That's perfectly fine. Okay. Roadhog. Roadhog doesn't fit into roles very well in Overwatch 1, so he could really do either. You know, if his hook and his one-shot are super good, if the threat of Roadhog is what makes him good, he kind of plays the main tank role, where he is a walking bubble of space around him, because no one can contest him inside of this area, right? That is kind of like the argument for the main tank. But if he's supplementary, he is feasting off of what his main tank does. So main tank finds really good disruption, then he's going to find a hook. You know, in Overwatch 1, he would combo with Halt, even though, like, Halt isn't really a thing anymore. Just kind of, he is bully, right? He's a bully of an off angle. But I think we should lean into that less so in hard damage and maybe more in utility, right? He's got Vape and he's got the new Pigpen. I think the new Vape is okay to tone down a little bit and then just allow him to be, like, super hard to deal with, because when he vapes, he's not doing much damage, so you can potentially reclaim some space if you're counting his cooldowns properly. I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea for an off tank. Ball times Hog has potential. I mean, that's a classic strategy, right? Pulled pork. Sorry, not pulled pork. That was Hog and Ball torture that we're talking about there. That's what they used to call it back in the day. So basically, I think specifically with Pigpen, this is a space controller, right? You are not going to be coming in against a Roadhog with a lot of the more CC elements of his kit rather than his damage. I think that's probably the healthiest way that you can make an off-tank version of Roadhog, where it leans into his abilities more or less so than the one-shot, and trying to set up situations or capitalize on situations from your other tank or maybe your other DPS, right? I also think, just as a personal thing, I think if Hook pulled in only half of the total distance of it, so like let's say at 20 meters here, I pull in this guy, instead of being pulled all the way to me, he just gets pulled to the 10-meter line. That makes him more utility focused. That gives them more counterplay. But it still means that, like, if they're in the 5-meter radius, like super close to me, I'm still that threat. I'm still that bully. And that is maybe when I can one-shot more. If they're over there, I have to aim it more. I have to rely on a teammate, something like that. Or I need to make sure I have my Pigpen out, and it's more of like an escape trap, stuff like that. That could be really interesting. Also, just pulling a tank out of position can be a really powerful tool, as we know in Overwatch 2, and force a lot of resources. Like, I do think that Hog has more potential in Overwatch 1 format, like, as that kind of off tank. And I'm saying, like, probably abandon the main tank version, especially with this. And we don't want Overwatch 2 Hog in our game at all, right? We want to have a new playstyle of Hog that has some other potential, I think. And I think there is a way to salvage this rework, at least in that regard. So that is the halfway point here. Actually, that's more than the halfway point here. So those are all the characters that are generally the same, mildly reworked. And for the most part, you see that they've kept their roles, right? My big problem here was that trying to find off tanks is really hard. For the new characters especially, they just really aren't designed that way, and off tanks can be really frustrating. You don't really want them to be super overbearing. So for the next one, I do have another off tank. I'm thinking about Doomfist for this one. Now, Doom is, complete new kit equipped for, what's it called? Complete new kit. It makes him an interesting dive tank substitution, because he doesn't really create the chaos as effectively like a Ball does for a disruption tank, for somebody who has less shields, or less general pressure to help his team. He is damage, he is mobility, he is look at me, distraction character, makes them pump resources into him. And to me, that just kind of screams off tank, does it not? You can kind of come in with, let's say my Winston has jumped in, he's doing bubble, and then all of a sudden his bubble's about to come down, and I just kind of come in, and I create a lot of chaos here, right? I create a lot of potential disruption. Damage can maybe go down, you know, I'm not saying like all the numbers are all the same, but now there's this big force that can really kill us in here because the Winston set him up. So the Winston can now chill while Doom is in here stalling time, blocking, getting overhealth. I think leaning into his overhealth might be really interesting. Less so damage, more overhealth utility could be really cool for Doom. But I do think that a higher damage off-tank option as opposed to D.Va, I kind of say like the middle point between D.Va and Zarya, where Zarya doesn't have the mobility, but D.Va doesn't have the highest kill threat like Doomfist potentially could, right? So in order to play this style with these other dive tanks, even like a Wrecking Ball, although I don't think that would be as good, then with a Winston, you could really wreak havoc, go much faster, stuff like that. If Winston can play greedier, he doesn't need to devote as much resources to him to stay in the fight because this Doomfist is here really making it hell for the other team. It's higher risk, it's faster play, it's higher reward. I think just having those damage off tanks are fine if they're done in a way that is still skillful and you have a lot of counterplay to them. With Doom's susceptibility to CC, lower health pool, I think that really does work for his role. You know, Hog is a harder sell, but I think Doom is one of those that could still potentially blow up like his kind of like his old days, right? So Doom to me, and again, like he's the chaos that he brings is much harder to set up than Ball, so I don't think he would work as a main tank so much. So I can really see off tank Doom. The only problem is that I don't really see him working with a Reinhardt or a Roadhog. No, Roadhog would be off tank, but like, you know, those kind of characters, like brawly characters, even though he is good in a brawl, I think that's a lot harder to justify. Maybe if you put more power in his punch and his slam, less so than his like core damage, that could work as well. Basically be like a, hey, don't escape from me, I'm gonna let my main tank get to you type deal. That could be really interesting. Maybe he sets up from the side and then he punches people in and he causes chaos when his main tank gets there. That could be interesting. That could be cool. I'm really interested to see what they kind of do with the Doomfist there. So, Orisa, again, completely new kit. She's equipped for Brawl and Sustain, although a little more Brawl than like pokier stuff, even though she's got some range. But I want to focus on the engagement part of her kit and less so on the sustain part of her kit, because you don't need so much sustain, fortify, with an off tank, because they can make up for your weaknesses. So Orisa fortify can either be completely replaced or really toned down because you have other things that help her, right? We can finally let her get headshot again and fortify or something like that. That could really help make this character feel better. That can feel more interesting to fight against, right? So, you know, we can have, what do I have here? Javelin toss, in addition to making javelin spin knockback more, and maybe even give it like higher time while you're in it, could really help, right? So if Orisa's trying to create space, she needs to get in there and be a threat, right? So javelin spin needs to be probably better. It needs to, I would think, last longer, maybe even make her go faster. And then I'm totally fine with the spear kind of going further, creating a distance, putting her in a nice range for her, and less so of a nice range for you. That creates space. Both of those create a lot of space for your team. Now, if you want to go the fortify route, of course, then you get there and you fortify, and then once the fortify is done, or it's really not working out so well, then your off tank comes in and you help you, and then you go for more spears and spins and all. Of course, then you have to change the numbers and everything. Don't get me wrong, I do understand that you don't want Ori to be unkillable. I do think the point is to give her more weaknesses. But another option is that you could replace fortify entirely with a very weak, and I cannot stress this enough, extremely weak, small range, high cooldown, pull, halt of some version. Bring back some old dynamics and new ones with her kit. Prevent escaping, so you can set people up better to take the space, right? So let's say somebody's trying to get around a corner, you halt them and then you spear them right after the halt, and so now they're in a much worse position. They're not going to be able to engage faster, gives you more space to take, stuff like that, right? People running away, people walking at your team, you can stop them, put them in your spear spin range, and now you're spinning them away trying to get that stuff. That could be really interesting, right? Fortify without speed penalty, but then less damage reduction, all this annoying nonsense. Also, if we're past Orisa, it's because ads kidnapped me. Oh, yeah, no. I think there's a world where Fortify is just the weakest part of her kit. In fact, maybe it is just CC reduction. Maybe it's a much lower damage reduction, right? That's okay. I think that's perfectly fine. Maybe, yeah, like maybe it's not CC immunity. Maybe it's like knockback reduction, other CC immunity, right? Just stuff like that to make Orisa more vulnerable, but then you give her more powerful tools to keep that power fantasy, right? So that's why I'm like not against a, again, incredibly weak version of Halt, right? Something like that. Orisa, I think as an off tank would need a lot more changes, and I really want to not fundamentally change these characters as much as I humanly can, right? So, with that in, another main tank for the books, but playing much differently than her old version. Okay, next up we have Junker Queen, who is weird. There's a lot of weird characters in this game. I say weird. She's just a main tank. Quite literally, she screams main tank, right? She's got a really good engage tool with Shout that helps her team get into, which I think is really crucial. She has really good sustain tools with her bleed, which is also tied to her player skill, which is a really nice aspect of her. She has very clear weaknesses like her range and her hurt box, but she has ways to overcome them, right? She has Knife to pull people out of the way. That's good disruption. That's what a good main tank can do, right? That is really key to this character. But she's not as effective until she can get into those ranges. She's got a really limited range, which is kind of part of the problem, right? But when she's in, Axe is something that can be really easily interrupted, but having an off tank with her, that's going to be really cool, right? It's going to be really interesting to allow Queen to get these types of swings. So you're going to have to be a little more cautious about how close you play to this character, right? And of course, off tanks can buy time healing up Junker Queen, right? So Orisa, the JQ goes to half, she hits a big axe rather. Diva comes in and eats her eats all the damage for 2 seconds. She heals back up to full. That's her resources coming back. It could work really well. I think her bleed would have to go like way down. That's the one caveat here. But I mean, I think this is a pretty cut and dry case. Queen is really fun as she is. I don't think she needs fundamental changes. So keep her in this main tank role for the time being, and that is perfectly fine, right? And speaking of perfectly fine main tanks, I think Ramattra is also really a standout here for like kind of has to be a main tank, right? I think by his current design, it seems a little linear, maybe even boring as a main tank, because it's just going to be, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to shield. We're going to walk behind my shield. The second we get to my shield, let's go. That kind of stuff, right? Or we just wait it out, give me my shield back. Okay, I throw a shield. Next corner, everything. They try to engage on you. They try to escape. You throw the grenade, right? You've kind of got it all in that department. But the problem also is that he's just super good mid-fight alone. He does not need resources because of block, right? He does not really require as many resources, or protection rather, because of his block. And I think that's like really where we need to take a closer look into that. Block meter, so being able to block only for a finite amount of time during any Nemesis mode, I think has to be implemented here. You have to force you have to force Ram to require resources from an off tank in order to be successful, right? You have to make sure that there is some team coordination here, because otherwise he's going to be wreaking havoc. You're not going to be able to kill him. You're not going to be able to interact with him. He'd be way, way, way too powerful. So you need to make it so that this is a little more skillful. Maybe it's only 3 seconds out of every Nemesis mode where you get some blocks. So you have to really pick and choose what is going to be the best times for you. I think that's a really important distinction to make here, right? I also think that Nemesis should be on a longer cooldown, just to encourage more slow and methodical play, because we need a couple of tanks that aren't just full brawl characters. I think the brawl thing should be when you're, in a different mid fight. I think if you put a little more power into Nemesis mode, and comparatively, you can play slower and play this character to a different strength, because Nemesis mode will be so nerfed. And I think that is a really good thing for Ramattra, but it also brings synergy in with some Sigma. It brings some synergy in with those slower characters, even like a Ramattra, or not Ramattra, a Roadhog or something. Even like a Ball, I don't think is like a terrible idea as well when you play like a slower variant. That could be really interesting, right? But yeah, most of the problem I see coming from Nemesis, coming from the power behind Nemesis. But Ramattra, I mean, it's just, I don't want to change him too much. That's a main tank right there. Nothing else. So with that, I've gone through almost all of them. I want to count up our off tanks here. So I've got 1 off tank, 2 off tank, 3 off tank, 4 off tank, 5 off tank, right? So that's 5 off tanks. And then we're going to have the rest of them. So that's going to be 1 main tank, 2 main tank, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So to round it out, a nice round 6 and 6, let's talk about Mauga as an off tank. And I'm going to admit with you guys, this one is tough. This one is a bit of a stretch. It is a little undercooked, I won't lie to you. But I want to put the idea out here because I think it's interesting, and I don't think we want main tank Mauga running around, because shooting into tanks only having hard sustain for himself is going to be boring. It's going to be super linear. It's going to feel really bad in 6v6 because it's going to be harder to do what you want to do. And they're going to have to buff him like crazy, make him more frustrating. We really don't want that one, right? So let's go crazy here. Let's take Cardiac and Stomp and kind of shift them into team utility options in some form or fashion. So starting with Stomp, I think, it could be a risky stun option for Mauga. I think less so than like a super good like engage tool or disengage tool where he has so many like damage, like he can't get knocked back, he can't get canceled, he has damage reduction, all of that. We can remove a lot of that stuff and make it a riskier option to get a really good knockdown slam value, right? Make it easier to counterplay that, but basically help it and get enabled by a main tank who takes that space, right? Get as much space taken from your main tank, then your off tank Mauga can go for something aggressive like this, but also he could use Overrun instead to go check the other angles, and I think that's really important, right? Mauga could be a character who's just kind of running around and going like, hey, get out of my space, this is my space, right? And then you look over there and you're like, oh god, those guys are popping up. I go over here, hey guys, let's not do this, right? Or you could use it mid-fight, kind of like run into cores, and all of that, but you can't do it like too willy-nilly. You have to wait for the rest of your team to walk up with you, or else you're gonna die. Because I think also Cardiac could have a really interesting idea. So you see, he's got his overhealth that he gains from shooting on fire targets, the crit targets rather. I have an idea that if Cardiac gave much less lifesteal, but transferred his shields that he currently has when he shouts, and there's no option to do this, it's going to happen. When he decides to shout, right, I'll give you kind of like a max overshield value, he could give it to his allies. It just completely wipes off of him and spreads it to his allies. Amongst them maybe, but I think it'd be cool to give it his max value, right? That might be a little too much, but that way, Mauga actually has to give up some of his sustain to then give it to his team to work with, right? That could be really interesting. I think that would actually, Reinhardt shield goes down, so then Mauga kind of injects him with some overhealth that he was able to build up because he's been shooting and actually getting it, and give him a little bit of regular, what's it called? Over like lifesteal, so that then he can stay in the fight and keep going. Stuff like that, right? Then it forces Mauga to continue trying to get as much critical damage as possible, because he needs to get those overshields back. Now, I think while he's shouting, he should probably be gaining overshields too. He just sheds all of what he had at the beginning, because you still want to bring that dynamic of healing your actual health bar over your overhealth with the lifesteal. But basically, this version of Mauga, and of course, I don't want him to be a tank buster. There's plenty of other things you can do to fix that. Even in Overwatch 1, that's not really the point of the team. But making Mauga play riskier, and yeah, again, like, he's closer ranged, all of that stuff. Playing to bully, playing to enable his other tank more could work. I think there's a world where you could save Mauga, especially if you lean into Overrun being a utility risky option rather than a super get out of jail free card or get into jail free card type of thing. And of course, Cage Fight. I didn't even like consider Cage Fight too much, but that is a very good, I mean, it kind of screams off tank to me. It keeps every character in the same spot, enables a lot of crazy combinations and stuff like that. That's 6v6 Overwatch in a nutshell. So with all of that, that is 6 and 6. And again, I do want to stress, like, creative exercise. It's assuming old 6v6, it plays very similarly to old 6v6, and it doesn't necessarily reflect my views of what I want from the new 6v6. I do think that characters should have a lot more, what's it called? Agency, able to interact with everybody, and having more options is definitely a good way to do that. They just need to have the correct weaknesses that are exploitable enough to make them fun and powerful, but not super frustrating or bad in general, which is again, whole nother topic for a different day. But that is what I think of making sure we have enough off tanks. I didn't talk about that as much. I want to make sure we have off tanks in this game. I don't want to be looking at Diva and Sigma only in my games forever and ever during those tests. I want to have other combinations that look wacky and weird. And I also don't think that they need to be solely main tanks or solely off tanks. I brought up a couple options that could be any. They could be either. They could play the role depending on the map and the comp, which could be really interesting. And I see there's a lot of potential there, which I think could be really cool. So that is it for me. What do you want to see from the 6v6 test? And do you think these characters should be in different roles? I do want to hear from you. Please subscribe while you're at it. I do really appreciate it. And like the video. This is streamed live, twitch.tv/LaneHemingway if you want to get in on the discussion live. And if you want free 3 free months to my Twitch channel, that is going to be the link below in my Discord. Please join the Game of the Year nominee prediction. That is going to close very soon. Your window of opportunity is going to be up probably next week. We don't know exactly when, but I would say probably then. So get those in as soon as possible. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Have a good day.